All right, well, welcome to my second presentation. Let's go ahead and pray before we start. Father, thank you for just giving us your word, Lord. Thank you for revealing yourself to us in it and giving us yourself, Lord, that it really is the gift that we can know you and have a relationship with you. Father, we thank you for those of us in this class that you've given us the ability to learn Hebrew. It's a privilege that not many get, and so I just ask that you'd help us to continually be thankful for that and to to put the time into it that we have the responsibility to as a result of being given this opportunity. We pray that you bless our study of Hosea 11, 1-6. Help us to see wonderful things in your word. We pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen. Well, we're coming near the end of the semester, so today we'll be doing Hosea 11, 1-6. And this has been a not really super challenging passage for me grammatically. I mean, there's definitely some weird stuff in here, but I think the big thing is 11:1, and I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about. So we'll do the translation first, and then we'll go from there. When Israel was a boy, I loved him. So out of Egypt I called my son. They called to them, then they went away from me. To Baals they were sacrificing, and to idols they were burning incense. But I taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by his arm. Yet they did not acknowledge that I healed them. With cords of mankind I pulled them, with ropes of love. And I became to them like those who lift the yoke upon their jaws. And I turned to him, I caused him to eat. He will not return to the land of Egypt, but Assyria, he will be his king, because they have refused to listen. So the sword will whirl in his cities, and it will destroy the bars of his gates, and devour him because of their plans. Now, before we get started, I think it's probably warranted to just give a few general hermeneutical comments. In my last presentation, I did a few comments about my overall approach to textual criticism, and so this is kind of in the same vein, but really more about hermeneutics in general. So there's going to be an obvious challenge here that we're going to have to deal with. I call it an apparent coup de grace of apostolic interpretation. That's what some liberal commentators would have us believe. I'm just going to sidestep that until the end of the presentation. So at the beginning, we're just going to go verse by verse and and deal with 11:1 at the end. So we'll think about 11:1 in the greater context of Hosea, and then 11:1 in the greater context of the whole canon, namely Matthew 2. And one other thing that I'd like to say, I'm shamelessly and intentionally mingling theology with interpretation. I'll probably get a lot of flack from some people in general about that, but I stick to it because I think we actually all do it, whether we want to admit it or not. So I'm just going to roll with it. As Luther said, sin boldly. All right. So some general grammar and syntax comments. You might remember in my last presentation, I started with some observations about the grammar and the syntax patterns that I saw in that passage. Well, I think I'll start by bringing up one of the ones that I mentioned last time. I said the general suffix pattern seems to be the singular form refers to Israel, and the plural forms refer to Israelites. This is the simplest way to explain data. So that's what I said last time. Well, things have changed a lot. That was back when the world was simpler. It's not that way anymore. So the suffixes get confusing in this one. And then just an alert, there's some strange verbs ahead. There's one that, I won't spoil the surprise. Strange verbs ahead. Alert, alert. Okay, and then just some quick formatting comments. I've got the text, the Hebrew text, at the top of the slide for every verse, and if it's got a verbal root, i.e. if it's a participle, an infinitive, or a verb, I'm highlighting it in yellow, and then if it needs some kind of lexical study, I'm going to highlight it in green. That way you can kind of see those throughout the presentation. Okay, so let's begin. Hosea 11:1. And you guys have all succeeded in exerting a measure of positive peer pressure on me, so I am going to attempt to pronounce the Hebrew. So, yeah, we'll see how this goes. Ki na'ar Yisrael va'ohavehu Umimitz Raim Karati Livni. When Israel was a boy, I loved him. So out of Egypt I called my son. So we've got three verbs. Excuse me, I'm misreading my own colors. We've got two verbs in this verse. The first, which was va'ohavehu, that's a cow, vav consecutive, prefix conjugation, first common singular, with a third masculine singular suffix. So, and that's from ahav. And then we've got karati, which is a cow, suffix conjugation, first common singular, from kara. Now we got some text critical issues to work through on this one. There's two issues under the letter A, which you will see at the very end, right before the sof pasuk. So if you go look at note A, you'll see the Old Greek actually says his children or sons. That's the ta tekna autu instead of my son. It's also plural in the Targum if you go look that up. I think each reading is equally hard because we're going to see a switch from singular to plural from verse 1 to verse 2. So we got singular in the first part of verse 1, and then we've got plural in verse 2. So if we take a plural at the end of verse 1, that means we're just saying we think the plural starts sooner. If we take it as a singular at the end of verse 1, we're saying we just think the plural start in verse 2. So equally hard. There's fewer consonants in the Masoretic text, so I'm going to take it for that reason. And then the critical apparatus also suggests that instead of my son, we perhaps there's a prepositional phrase lo, to or for him that can be read, but there's no evidence given, so we're going to reject that one. So let's think about some of these. Now, we're going to do the words that are highlighted in green for lexical analysis. And so let's talk about na'ar first. So probably the simplest way that I think to explain na'ar, and I got this from Hebrew 3 with Dr. Hardy, which if I remember correctly, George, I think you were in that class, and Drake as well. I was trying to think through if anybody else was, not that I can recall at least. Well, we did a word study in that class on this word actually. So, and what I remember studying, going through very detailed word study was it's essentially youth relative to the age or position of the speaker or of the main character of the narrative or whatever. So it's not necessarily always a young person, but it's kind of like relative to the main character in the narrative. So there's this kind of positional element to it, and it's masculine. There's na'ara, which is basically a feminine version of the same word. The reason that I think it's worthwhile to point out that it's masculine is that there's a passage in Ezekiel that this reminded me of where you might recall Yahweh is telling the prophet about how he discovered Israel, and he's saying, like, basically, I walked by along the road and there was this infant covered in blood, and I cleaned off the blood and clothed her, and then I came by again and she had fully grown, and then there's this picture of like God taking her as a wife, and that sort of thing, all a metaphor for his relationship with Israel. But it's interesting that he would use a feminine image there and a masculine image here. I don't really think there's much to make of it, honestly. Just that it's one of a number of metaphors that God kind of uses to explain this relationship, this special relationship. So the next word is ahav, and I think it would be valuable. There's like a gazillion uses of this word throughout the Hebrew Bible, so I don't want to go through a bunch outside of Hosea, but I think it would be valuable to go through several of the uses throughout Hosea, just maybe to understand the impact that this word would have when reading chapter 11, verse 1. So let's just blitz through these real quick. All through chapter 2, it's nominalized to lovers. And I think it's a participle, if I remember correctly, in all cases. And then in 3:1, go again, love a woman who is loved by another man. So it's still this idea of kind of a one-directional love. And then 4:18, their rulers dearly love shame. You have loved a prostitute's wages, 9:1, and became detestable like the thing they loved. So almost every use so far is actually a very negative use. It's not 9:15, but a lot of the other ones, it's Israel loving something they're not supposed to love. This one is probably actually a positive one. I actually just watched Adam's presentation, so but it seems like that one's probably positive. And then we come to 11:1. When Israel was a child, I loved him. So I guess my main point here is that when you look back at the use of this word throughout Hosea, you get all these examples of how Israel is loving something they're not supposed to love, or just loving something that's outright wicked and evil. And 11:1 starts, when Israel was a child, I loved him. That's the ESV. Or when Israel was a boy, I loved him. 12:8, again, a bad one. He loves to oppress. But then 14:5, there's a measure of hope here. I will love them freely. So it fits the biblical picture of God's first view of Israel that we see in Scripture. So Deuteronomy 4:37, and because he loved your fathers and chose their offspring after them and brought you out of Egypt. This is really remarkable, actually. If you look, it's actually the same sequence here. He loved your fathers and chose their offspring and brought you out of Egypt. That's a really remarkable verse if you meditate on it. And then Exodus 4:22, Israel is my child, my firstborn. And so we'll say this, God's love is manifest in his redemptive work for the people of Israel. We see that right here in 11:1. So now for some grammar and syntax comments. Key, what's that doing there? It doesn't seem to be following the normal function. Well, it seems like it's probably a temporal key. And Halot kind of brings this out, and so does Vander Merwe on page 433. But by the way, I finally bought Halot. Like, I've been wanting to buy it for probably 2 years now. Logos has a bundle, $275 for Halot and BDAG, and so it was well worth the money. I'm already loving it. Highly recommend it. The nice thing about that package is you're probably saving like $150 over if you were to buy them each individually. So if you like both languages, that's a good way to go. Anyway, so this temporal key takes the reader back through history to the nation-state's early days. So Anderson Friedman says this, the time reference in the opening verse is to the most critical period in Israel's history, its childhood, when the people were delivered from bondage. So I would like to ask a question on a clausal level. Should we see these moving in chronological order? And I kind of hinted at that with my quotation from Deuteronomy 4 earlier, where you get that God loved the fathers and chose the children and drew them out of Egypt. So I think it's fair to say that it could be moving in chronological. Theologically, it would be a very sensible conclusion. When Israel was a boy, I loved him. And so this is the reason that I've translated the Vav with a resultative sense. So in other words, God sets his love on them, and then he brings them out of Egypt. So that was why I translated it. When Israel was a boy, I loved him. So out of Egypt, I called my son. So now, in interpretive questions. Has anyone heard this verse anywhere else? Just kidding. We'll deal with it at the end. Okay, verse 2. Karu lahem. Kain halku mipnehem. Labalim yezabechu velapsilim yekaterun. They called to them, then they went away from me. To Baals they were sacrificing, and to idols they were burning incense. Now you'll notice at the outset that my translation differs quite a bit from several of the major English ones, and I'm just going to read for you real quick. I'll start with the NIV, and then I'll do the Holman and the ESV. So this is the NIV. But the more I called Israel, the further they went from me. Holman. The more they called them, the more they departed from me. And then NIV, the more they were called, the more they went away. So you can see here, there's several issues in this verse already. And that was really just the first line. So for verbs, we got 4 of them in this verse. First, we've got karu, that's kal suffix conjugation, third common plural from kara. Then we've got halku, which is the same conjugation, it's kal suffix conjugation, third common plural from halak. And then this Yezabehu, that's a PL, prefix conjugation, third masculine plural from zavach. And then finally we've got Ekaterun, which is a PL, prefix conjugation, third masculine plural from Qatar. And I didn't actually mention it in my parsing, but that little, I can't remember, what was that called, a paragogic noon? I can't remember exactly. but that little noon there. So anyway, text critical issues. We've got a couple in verse 2. So first, note A, the Old Greek is singular. Okay, so let's look at the critical apparatus. Kathos, metakalisa. So that metakalisa is a singular aorist. So apparently also the Syriac, but I can't read that, so I'm not really going to deal with that. It's also been proposed as often as I called, and that's, I think, where you get all the English translations, which is quite interesting that all the English translations would go that way, because I don't see any I don't see any textual evidence for that, so that's quite surprising, especially something like the ESV. If any of you know something about this, I would actually really appreciate if you could let me know what's going on here, but I'm quite surprised that the ESV would make a choice like this. Anyway, I'm not finding any manuscript evidence for that second part, so we're going to go ahead and reject that. The reason I'm going to stick with the Masoretic on the conjugation being plural is because I think you'll kind of see in the back and forth later, but I'm gonna kind of table that for a second, and hopefully by the end of the verse you'll understand why I picked that. But I'm going with the Masoretic here on the verb. And then note B, the Old Greek reads that they departed from my face. So both of these readings are the same length, and they have an identical consonantal text. The Masoretic is more difficult, which would lean us that way. But I think the contextual weight really makes the Old Greek rendering attractive. So I'm going to assume that the Old Greek reflects the original manuscript, and I'm going to go with that one. Okay, so now we kind of tabled Korah and didn't deal with it in 11.1, but now we're going to deal with it in 11.2 because it's highly relevant at this point. So it's very, very frequent in the Old Testament. I think it shows up first in either chapter 1 or chapter 2 Genesis, and then it's all over the place. So the first entry under Halon is to call someone over, and it seems like this is the right entry actually for this instance because of the Lamed preposition that comes right after it. Now I think there's some intentional wordplay here. If you recall, that word Korah was in verse 1 as well. It was it was the second to last word, that karati. So I think this is intentional. It's a level of wordplay, and we'll come back to that in a second. On a grammar and syntax level, we've got the switch in conjugation for Korah. So we got the karati in verse 1, and then here in verse 2 we got karu. So that indicates that there's a change in subject, I think. So we got to ask the question, who is calling out to whom? And I'm going to go a direction that's, let's say, somewhat off the wall here, but I mean, you can let me know if you agree or disagree. So Anderson Friedman says the object them, that's lahem, cannot be the Israel of verse 1 who is called him. So that's Anderson Friedman's rationale. However, Anderson Friedman has been super obvious, like all throughout the entire commentary, that Hosea is very free with his conjugations and with his suffixes. So I'm kind of surprised that Anderson Friedman would be dogmatic at all about this, to be honest. So he says maybe this is the Baal Peor incident where the women come out and entice the Israelite men. That's a decent idea. I think actually the parallelism from verse 1 to verse 2 indicates that the Baals and the idols are actually the subject, and the Israelites are the object. So, in other words, what I mean is in verse 1 you get God calling out to the Israelites, out of Egypt I called my son, and then in verse 2 somebody else is calling. And who's the somebody else? Well, we see it right here in line 2 of verse 2, the Baals and the idols. So I would say this indicates that there's two competing for Israel's affections, Yahweh and the Baals or idols. And then it's interesting. There's also a back and forth here that we can see in the Lamed preposition. So the idols call out to the Israelites, and then the Israelites walk away from God, and then the Israelites reciprocate to the idols by sacrificing to them. And so it kind of heightens the tension where essentially God was the one who started this whole thing, pulling them out of Egypt, and then they enter into this reciprocal back and forth relationship with the idols instead. So now let's ask some interpretive questions on this verse before we move on. Based on the way I took the verse, you would be fair to ask, what on earth does it mean for an idol to call to Israel or to call to anyone? Is this like a manner of speech, or is it something more? And I'm gonna say that it could be something more. Again, feel free to disagree with me. I'd be really curious to hear a response on this. I think we have warrant theologically to say that demonic activity and idolatry are actually kind of bound up together, and I get that mostly from the New Testament. But I would encourage you to go read those verses and see if you agree with me. And then I would say then that we can take the view that the idols, even though they're simply material objects, they're actually calling for the affections of the Israelites in the sense that there's a demonically sourced attraction to the idol. There's an enticement going on by the demonic activity behind the idol. And I really get this from 1 Corinthians 10, where he says something to the effect of, Paul says something to the effect of, an idol is nothing. It's just an object. But I don't want you to be participants with demons. And so there's this idea that there's demons behind idol worship. So that's kind of where I'm getting this from. So I also think this fits the spirit of promiscuity that was mentioned earlier in Hosea several times. So that's an interesting thing to chew on as well. All right, verse 3. Va'anoki tergalati le'Ephraim kacham al Zerootiv, Velo Yadu ki Rafa'atim. In the translation, but I taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by his arm, yet they did not acknowledge that I healed them. So verbs, we've got 4 here. So the first, it's a tifil, suffix conjugation, first common singular from regal. Or it could be a hifil suffix conjugation, first common singular from regal. And then the second one, we have a similar confusion. We have a cal, infinitive absolute from lakach, or with a suffix, or maybe we have something else. Fortunately, the last two are fairly straightforward. We have a cal suffix conjugation, third common plural from yada, and then we have a cal suffix conjugation, first common singular from rafa with a third masculine plural suffix. Okay, so text critical issues for verse 3. The Old Greek has a first person verb and a singular subject. Okay, so let's go look at note A. You can see that first person and singular subject. Singular object, excuse me, that's auton, that's an object. So they propose what that would look like. And so the Old Greek is an easier reading on both counts. It's quite a bit easier, actually. And so it kind of seems like maybe it's a harmonization. And we'll get into why it's easier in a second. The Syriac and the Targum seem to have a prefix conjugation 1cs verb, presumably for the same reason. So we're going to go with the Masoretic here. And I think you'll see why it's like dramatically more difficult. It's really hard to see why anybody would change to this verb. Okay, and then note B. There's a few manuscripts, the Old Greek, the Syriac, the Vulgate, they have a first common singular suffix instead of a third masculine singular. And I see these two kind of going together, actually. It would be pretty difficult to accept without taking the Old Greek and the Syriac reading on point A. So contextually, they're kind of bound up together. So we're just going to go with the Masoretic here. So a little bit of lexical analysis on regal. What is this word about? Well, you might recognize it from regal, the seglet noun. This is actually the only instance of regal in the latter prophets. And the morphology kind of makes it difficult to categorize. The issue is that this word has a pretty wide semantic range. There's like, if you look at Halot or any lexicon, I assume, there's a number of options. And so that can make it kind of challenging. Anderson Friedman kind of goes, he's not super dogmatic, but he goes with leading or walking in front of. Now he rejects the traditional rendering, stating that a na'ar is not taught to walk. And that's a fair point. I couldn't find any examples of a na'ar being of like, toddler age. It's usually like a child and up. And, you learn to walk between 12 and 18 months for most kids. So that's a fair point. However, it seems like it might be a little bit strict with the metaphors, so I'm not sure that I buy that as being a reason to toss the traditional rendering, I mean. Okay, so let's move on to grammar and syntax. We got va'anoki. Now this is, it's emphatic. This is the easiest grammar syntax we'll talk about in the entire passage. It's just an emphatic pronoun, and it's awesome. You can see it's not needed because we've got first person here in the verb, so va'anoki is emphatic. Okay, now what about this kaham? What's going on with this thing? So Macintosh, he says if the text is to be retained, the word kaham must be understood as an unusual form of the infinitive absolute cal of lakach. Okay, so you see what he's saying. Basically, the lamed's gone, and then we've got the wrong vowel pattern for an infinitive absolute, so it's kind of just a weird form, which we have seen in Hosea, to be fair. Now, Gesenius, which is also quoted by Macintosh in the same section, says that an infinitive absolute does not take a suffix. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Anderson-Friedman says this: the text as it stands is possible. And for what it's worth, Anderson-Friedman does not go with the Masoretic text on this. If kach is recognized as a biconsonantal biform of lakach, a well-attested pattern. An infinitive absolute would satisfy the requirements of grammar, and the line would describe the rescue of Israel from Egypt. Okay, so Anderson-Friedman says we can go that way. I don't want to go back. Let me see if I can go back. I don't want to get to that yet. All right, so I'm tentatively going with the infinitive absolute, although as you can see, there's probably a case to be made for something else. The problem is the suffix. Why does it have a suffix on it? This is the first time I've encountered an infinitive absolute with a suffix on it. I don't know if there's any other examples. I would assume by Gesenius saying that it does not take a suffix, that if there's any, there's not many at all. But maybe this is the one, and if we take the descriptive grammar approach, then we're not putting down rules, we're just talking about how language tends to work. So I'm gonna go with infinitive absolute. Any of you guys that are really good at morphology, or if anybody has Tully, I don't have it with me right now, please look that up, because I'd be really interested to see what he says as well. All right, so now let's move on to this whole tifil thing. What is that? I never heard of that. I tried to parse this thing when I was working through the passage, and I was like, I don't know what to do with this. So I looked at BibleWorks and Logos, and they both said it's a tifil. Like, okay, what's a tifil? Oddly enough, I actually looked it up, and I found a free Hebrew grammar online that's like all crowdsourced, and I'll try to find it and put it in the text when I post this video. But it seems like it might be a decent resource. I only looked at a few things on it, so I can't really say too much about it. But anyway, Anderson-Friedman says that this could be a tifil. Okay, so Halot, though, disputes that the stem even exists, and Gesenius, he seems to be the source of the modern translations, and BDB agrees with him as well. And Gesenius basically says the tifil has had some form of attestation as a stem since the Middle Ages. So there have been Hebrew grammarians talking about the tifil stem since 1100, I think, was the earliest one that he cited. So that's something. And then there's some other possible references, and I looked these up. They're really not clear, especially Jeremiah 12:5. I really didn't get that one. Maybe 22:15. And then the Net Bible noted Ezra 4:7, I think, as another one, but it said the Aramaic of Ezra 4:7, and the Aramaic starts in 4:8, so I'm wondering if maybe that translator was just a little mixed up. And I didn't find any tifils anywhere in 7 or 8, so anyway. These are the only other two possible references that I'm aware of. So extremely rare stem, maximum of 3 occurrences from what we can tell. So most people seem to agree that if the tifil is real, then it has a similar semantic force to the hifil stem. It's just got a tav instead of a hey. So what does the hifil of Regal mean? Well, Halot doesn't give anything. There's no instances of it apparently. So in conclusion, it's a crapshoot. So I have not seen any evidence to lead me toward any kind of confidence in any direction, and so I'm just going to stay the course, take the English translations, and say that it means I taught Ephraim to walk wash my hands of it and move on. Okay, so let's look at this from the perspective of rhetoric. So one of the things that I think we can see here is that there's this back and forth between Yahweh and the Baals. And this is the reason why I italicized I in my translation. In fact, I'm going to read verses 1 through 3 one more time and try to really emphasize this I the way that I see it in the passage. Verse 1. When Israel was a boy, I loved him. So out of Egypt I called my son. They called to them, then they went away from me. To Baals they were sacrificing, and to idols they were burning incense. But I taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by his arm. Yet they did not acknowledge that I healed them. So I really see a very emphatic I in this Va'anoki. It's really hard not to see God frustrated with his wayward son. So let me make an observation here at the end of verse 3, and verse 4 kind of is involved in this observation as well. So Yahweh calls himself Israel's healer in Exodus 15:26. I am Yahweh, your healer. And then again, we saw at the end of verse 3, they did not acknowledge that I healed them. Hosea 6:1 says, he has torn us that he may heal us. So the passage has begun in verses 1 through 4. And by the way, this verse in Exodus 15:26 is very related to the Exodus as well. The passage has begun in verses 1 through 4 with Yahweh reminding the reader of his redemptive role in the first Exodus, or if you were a Jew in Hosea's day, the Exodus. Okay, so let's move on to verse 4, and you'll see how that fits in as well. B'chalav le Adam em Shakem ba'avotot ahava ve'ehye lahem kimrime o al lehehem va'at Elive Okil. So the translation, with cords of mankind I pulled them, with ropes of love. And I became to them like those who lift the yoke upon their jaws. And I turned to him. I caused him to eat. So we got a lot of verbs in here, 5 of them. First is Emshakem, and that's a cow, prefix conjugation, first common singular, from mashak, with a third masculine plural suffix. And then second, we've got va'eye, that's a cow, vav consecutive prefix conjugation, first common singular, from haya. And then we have kimrime, which is a hifil participle, masculine plural, and it's actually construct. Well, at least in the Masoretic it's construct. We'll deal with that in a second. From room. And then next we've got this va'at, which is a hifil prefix conjugation, first common singular, from nata. Or it could be a hifil vav consecutive prefix conjugation, first common singular, from nata, if we go with note D on the textual criticism notes. So that you kind of got some options there, actually. And then last we've got okil, which is a hifil prefix conjugation, first common singular, from akal. Alright, now we're going to do the text critical issues for 4 and 5 together, because if you look at the way the apparatus groups them, they're kind of all covered at once. So we're going to go A through E all in the presentation under verse 4, and then we're not going to do any text critical notes for verse 5. Alright, so text critical note A. The critical apparatus is suggesting that the text is corrupted, or at least questioning if it's been corrupted, and it has been proposed to instead read cords of faithfulness or loving kindness. However, there is no textual evidence, so we're going to reject it. Now, next, in note B, the critical apparatus says probably, instead of what we read as a construct ending, we should see a final meme and take that yod off the end. So the resultant interpretation would be like almost nothing, um, because instead of having a construct, you would have you would have the ol being the object of the verbal idea, but in the construct version, if you were to really woodenly translate it, maybe it would be something like those lifters of the yoke, rather than the way I translated it, which is like those who lift the yoke. So actually, the way I translated it is really more like what the critical apparatus is suggesting. But honestly, that's just to make the grammar easier, and it's not necessary. And there's no evidence, so we're going to reject it. Okay, so note C. The critical apparatus says probably his jaws rather than their jaws on the basis of the Old Greek. This is for the same reason as the note in verse 1 where I said it's equally difficult. There's a switch in number. So it's hard to see one being easier to read than the other. There's not really much interpretive impact with either choice, so I'm just going to stick with the MT because there's not really any risk here. And then note D. This is an interesting one. The critical apparatus is saying that we should probably read both verbs here as vav consecutive prefix conjugation verbs. Now, there's no manuscript evidence for the second verb, although you might contend that that little vav hanging out on the end of a live is some kind of evidence. I don't think it is. So I'm gonna not go with the critical apparatus on Okil. However, for Va'at, I think it's actually not a bad idea, and it kind of shifts the tone to a more historical description of Yahweh's positive action towards Israel in the past. So I'm tentatively taking this one, and there's no consonantal change required. So let me know if you agree or disagree, or if you see something that I don't see here. Now the critical apparatus. Now we're on to verse 5 by this point. But we're going to go ahead and deal with it now. It's basically just asking if the last line, or the last line and the last clause, really, both is just an addition, but there's no evidence given, so we're just going to reject that. Okay, lexical analysis. What is the ol? Now, this is actually really interesting. Halot lists the cognates at the beginning of every entry, and you could probably lose a lot of time reading about cognates. But this one's really interesting. The Arabic cognate actually is used to refer to a neck ring for prisoners, which is going to make perfect sense when we think about the meaning of this verse. Now, ol typically refers to a wooden device placed on the neck of a beast of a plow animal. That doesn't make any sense. I don't know why I worded it like that. On the neck of a plow animal. We'll say that. Maybe I started writing beast of burden and then I changed to plow animal. I don't know. Anyway, forget that. Okay, so the logical question here is why the jaws? Because if it's placed on the back of the neck and it's saying I was like one who loosens it from upon the jaws, that doesn't really seem to fit where the yoke goes. So what's the deal with that? We'll come back to that in a second. So grammar and syntax in this verse. What on earth does cords of mankind mean? So Macintosh says this: the phrase is clearly metaphorical in intention, and together with the synonymous phrase which follows, conveys the sense, the bonds of close human relationship. The bonds of close human relationship. That really makes a lot of sense to me, actually. It fits the positive nature of the second clause. So on a clausal level, Anderson-Friedman says this: the parallelism as well as the use of the same prepositions with the parallel nouns. Again, we've got the bait here, and then we've got the bait here. And the chiasm of the matching phrases shows that a well-formed bicolon is present. Now, you've probably read Anderson-Friedman, these pages by this point, and you might remember that basically what Anderson-Friedman does to show this well-formed bicolon is he does a bunch of rearranging, which is not his pattern, so I was kind of surprised by that. And he spends like 3.5 pages doing it. It's really interesting, and it does make a lot of sense, but I'm not sure it was really necessary to make his point. So you can read him and see if you think I'm reacting wrongly or whatever. But I'm going to tentatively suggest that the answer is actually just found in the last clause. conceptually, it kind of makes sense that removing the yoke would enable the jaws of the animal to eat. So I'm also seeing a bicolon here. It's just a different one. I would, if I were a Masorete, maybe I would be writing those last three words up on the second line instead of breaking them down into the third line. Or maybe that was the BHS editors that did that. I don't know. But anyway, I'm seeing the action of removing the yoke very closely tied with this okeel. So just a different kind of bicolon. So Macintosh actually goes the same direction. So he says the reference to feeding and fodder which follows suggests strongly that the prior removal of the yoke is what Hosea intends. Now he's addressing a slightly different question there, but we both come to the same conclusions. That's kind of nice. So in the greater context then, this final clause, and this is actually Macintosh, not me, but I thought it was a really interesting note. He says this final clause could be a reference to the manna in the wilderness, enabling them to eat. And you can see that in the hifil of the call. So, very interesting comment, especially when you think about the Exodus context of these 4 verses. It really makes a lot of sense. So, now some interpretive question. What do the cords and ropes represent? It's not really clear. I mean, we got... certainly the second one, we've got the ropes of love, but the first one, it's like the cords of mankind, some kind of close relationship, as Macintosh suggested a few slides back. And so Anderson Friedman says this: Yahweh's leadership through the desert, which was misinterpreted by the Israelites to not be beneficent. Now, I'm actually kind of paraphrasing what Anderson Friedman says, but that's basically what he's saying, are represented by the cords and ropes. So then we come to the question, what does the yoke represent? And you might remember that Arabic cognate I brought up earlier. Basically, it's Israel's slavery under Egypt. Plain and simple. So this beast, or this plow animal, has been serving a harsh master, the Egyptians, and Yahweh has come to free the animal, that's the metaphor, and enable it to eat. So the theme, this is Anderson Friedman again, the theme of verses 1 through 4 is the contrast between Yahweh's generosity and Israel's ingratitude. So think about what we've seen so far in verses 1 through 4. Yahweh sets his sight of love on this little Na'ar, this boy, calls him out from slavery. And what happens? Well, the idols also call, and Israel turns to the idols. But it was actually Yahweh the whole time that showed all of this love and goodwill towards them, and freed them and enabled them to eat. So Anderson Friedman really hits it home here, I think. So a little bit of food for thought, and I'm not really actually going to come back to this in the presentation, but you'll see where I'm going with it by the time we're done, it's all said and done. But I'll just ask this question. How does a typological reading of this passage in light of the Exodus guide our thinking on the yoke? I'm just going to pause for a second. How does a typological reading of this passage in light of the Exodus guide our thinking on the yoke? Alright, think about it for yourself. We're going to move on. Verse 5. Lo yashuv el eretz Mitzrayim va'ashur hu malku ki me'anu Lashuv. Translation: He will not return to the land of Egypt, but Assyria, he will be his king, because they have refused to return. So we got 3 verbs here. First, yashuv, that's a cow prefix conjugation, third masculine singular from shuv. Then second, we've got manu, which is a pl suffix conjugation, third common plural from ma'an. And then last, we have lashuv, which is a cal infinitive construct from shuv with the lam preposition, as we typically see on a infinitive. So for text critical issues, we dealt with these in verse 4, so we're just going to go ahead and move on. But now you can see this is the line that the BHS editors were suggesting in note E was an addition. So, but they don't give any evidence, so we'll just reject it and move on. So grammar and syntax. What function does lo take here? In other words, is it actually saying he's not going to go back to Egypt? Or what's going on here? Anderson and Friedman says that this is an asseverative usage, which Anderson Friedman really likes that word. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but that word has come up a lot in that commentary. I had to look it up the first time. So, in other words, surely. But I'd like to ask this question. Why couldn't it just be a statement that God is not literally taking them back to the land of Egypt, but to Assyria instead? Okay, and then let's think about verse 5 from the perspective of rhetoric. This is the second time now in the passage. The first time was back in verse 3. This is the second time in the passage that Hosea has used a pronoun for emphasis. So back in verse 3 it was va'anoki. Here it's who. That second word in the second clause. In order for this reading of the second clause to make sense, implied copulative has to be there, I think. In other words, Assyria, he will be his king, because Malku is his king. Now we've got some interpretive questions to roll through. What does return to Egypt actually refer to? So, if you're reading this through the lens of all of the political games that are going on throughout Hosea, which we've seen a lot of evidence of, could it be political scheming to ally with Egypt instead of Assyria? In other words, almost if we take the low as just a pure negative, it would be God saying something to the effect of, you've been trying to scheme with Egypt to make something happen, but you're not going to return to Egypt. So that could be one way we could look at it. Honestly, we could look at this with multiple lenses. We could look at it with that lens. We could also say this is kind of unless you misunderstand about what this going into bondage is going to be. You're not literally going back to Egypt. You're going to Assyria instead. So, and then we need to ask this question. The very last word, this lashuv, to what or whom did Ephraim refuse to return? And it's clearly Yahweh. We see that because in verse 2 they go away, and now they've refused to return. So it must be returned to Yahweh, the one who brought them out of Egypt, the one who enabled them to eat. So this implies what we already know from Israel's history. We read this again and again and again and again in the Old Testament. Many gracious opportunities were given by a patient God to a stubborn people who would not turn to him. In fact, I quoted Anderson Friedman in my first presentation with a kind of a more elegant way of saying this. And these are some interesting verses. I think this Isaiah 65:2 and Romans 10:21 is a quotation of it, where basically God says, I held my hands out all day long to a disobedient people. And the images, he's been incredibly gracious to Israel. He's given many opportunities. And again and again and again, they have refused to return. And I think this is actually one of the main driving themes of the Old Testament, because it forces us to ask this question: what on earth is going to have to happen for Israel to finally return to Yahweh? And the answer is Jesus, Yeshua, Yahweh saves. So observation here in 11:5. There's a kind of reversal of the Exodus that's now being described, but not really an exact reversal. Instead of going back to Egypt, they're going to go to Assyria, which we've already discussed. Okay, so let's move on to 6. V'chala cherev ba'ariv v'kilta vadav, v'akala mimototehem. That's a hard one. The translation: so the sword will whirl in his cities, and it will destroy the bars of his gates and devour him because of their plans. I think this right here, these two words, whirl in, I actually updated my translation, so this is not the most recent version. But aside from that, it looks correct. So we got 3 verbs here. First, v'chala is a cow, vav consecutive, suffix conjugation, third feminine singular, from, well, probably from chul. That's kind of a tricky one. We'll come back to that. Second, we've got v'kilta, which is a PL, vav consecutive, suffix conjugation, third feminine singular, from kala. And then finally, we have v'akala, which is a cal, vowel consecutive suffix conjugation, third feminine singular. So you'll notice now that the conjugations are all the same. That's important in this verse from a call. Now, text critical issues. This is for the final word in the first line. The critical apparatus says it has been proposed that instead of Badiv, the text was Baniv or something to that effect. And the Otnok should be transposed here. In terms of content, it is logical. Sons instead of bars of gates. That actually kind of makes sense, the sword-consuming sons. But there's no evidence given, so we're just going to go ahead and reject that one. Now, I just got to admit, I'm not really sure what's going on in this note. If anybody could help me out with this, this is the very first note on page 1005 of BHS. Unfortunately, this actually made this verse unnecessarily tricky, the way it's split up from the one page to the next. But anyway, the note has a beta. I don't really know what that means. Honestly, I don't have a clue. But, there were no textual witnesses given for sport, so either way, it was born to be caught and destroyed, as Peter said, so we're just going to go ahead and reject it. If somebody wants to fill me in on this, I would much appreciate it. Or if somebody wants to look at Tully and see what he says, or another, really solid textual commentary. Okay, so for lexical analysis, we've got hul, which for halot, there's several options. What we've got here: go round, rage, dance, whirl. I think whirl was what I translated first, and then halot just suggests rage when it's used with cherev. So I thought, well, that makes sense. Unfortunately, actually, that's the only verse that halot provides to suggest that gloss. So, we probably could just pick any of the other ones and it would work. But I didn't see any reason to reject that rendering. Anderson-Friedman actually, though, goes with a different lexeme altogether, because they contend that the verb is typically used, that is, hul. They say that one is typically used to refer to writhing in pain. So it doesn't, if the sword is the subject, it doesn't really make sense for the sword to writhe in pain. So I understand their comment, but we see there's several other options for hul. So and a lot of them you could see as poetic descriptions of the activity of a sword, especially whirl. I mean, geez, in the hands of a skilled swordsman, that sounds perfect. So grammar and syntax. There's some wordplay going on. This isn't really grammar and syntax. I'm not sure why I put it in this category, but whatever. There's some wordplay going on between verse 4 and verse 6. So in verse 4, Yahweh made Ephraim to eat, and that was one of the beneficent actions that he did on behalf of Ephraim in leading the Israelites out of Egypt. But then in verse 6, Yahweh causes the sword to eat Ephraim's cities. Now, the causative is not there because there's no hifil, but you can certainly see that you've done all this. Now this is what's going to happen. It's implied in the vav consecutive suffix conjugation, which is sometimes called the prophetic perfect. Especially in a verse like this, it really seems to make sense to look at it that way. It's implied that Yahweh is the one making it happen. So Yahweh causes the sword to eat Ephraim's cities. Okay, now let's look at this on a clausal level. And I really just have more questions than anything here. Again, I mentioned a second ago that the way that this verse is broken up from page 1004 to 1005 of BHS makes it difficult to analyze this on a clausal level, especially because the Otnok ends up on page 1005. So it's just weird. I think what we really just have to ask is, how does this clause, according to the Otnok, really, we should be reading this word, and this word together, and then this word kind of last on its own, more or less. But where's the line, and what's the relationship between them? Let me actually just go back and look at how I rendered this in my translation, and then maybe, honestly, I could just throw a comma in here and it would fit the Masoretic pointing, or I could leave it as it is and it would fit BHS. So I don't know that it really has a huge bearing on at least translation. On interpretation, I'm not sure either. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. If any of you have any experience dealing with this issue where there's a bit of a weird conflict between BHS and the Masoretes. So let's move on. We've gone through the 6 verses now, so let's get to the big question that we're all wondering about. But before we get there, we need to do some pre-work. So I just want to talk about how Hosea talks about the Exodus. This is something that I've been thinking about all semester. And what really triggered me was this is something that I had heard before, but it was Thomas Smiley's presentation. I think his first one in chapter 2, when he talked about the Valley of Achor. I was really struck by this. So the first Exodus comes up frequently in Hosea, and it's a really dominant theme. God bringing the Israelites out of Egypt, and it's almost like this grounds for how ridiculous their idolatry is, because it's like, I'm the one who brought you out. We saw that in our passage here. I taught Ephraim to walk, but they went away and kept sacrificing to the Baals. So there's also kind of a reversal of the Exodus that's clearly mentioned, and I think you see that in this passage. They're not going to return to the land of Egypt, but they will go to Assyria. So that's some kind of a reversal, although it's not an exact reversal. So then I want to ask the question, does Hosea speak of a second Exodus? Because we know there's hope in Hosea, but is it fair to say that Hosea's hope is tied up in a second Exodus? And I think the answer is yes. So Hosea, I'm just going to pull out several verses here that support this idea. Hosea 2:2, and the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together, and they shall appoint for themselves one head, and they shall go up from the land, for great shall be the day of Israel. So what's my flag here? From the land. The land is big in the Exodus, okay? So I'll say that one tentatively. Hosea 2:17, there I will give her vineyards and make the valley of Achor a door of hope. That's when they're coming into the land. And then that last line, as at the time when she came out of the land of Egypt. Okay, there's clearly something there in that verse. Hosea 2:24, I will sow for her for myself in the land. Hosea 11:11, this one's kind of a question mark for me. Adam, I think you'll set us straight on this one, but Anderson Freeman actually does call this a second Exodus, but he calls it basically like one where they're terrified, and that's how he leaves it. So I don't know. Maybe this could be speaking. Maybe trembling like birds doesn't quite mean terror, but it's a very strong form of fear and reverence. And then there's some other possibilities. Hosea 6:3, which we mentioned earlier. And then Hosea 14:7, which says, I will freely love them. And so there's actually a number of other possibilities. I think one area that might be great for further study would be, and maybe this is just something I haven't read yet, but the relationship of growth and produce to the Exodus. So in other words, bringing them out of Egypt, putting them in the land, and then all of the metaphors, like the vineyard. You think of Isaiah where Yahweh plants a vineyard and puts a stone wall around it, and how that's kind of a metaphor for the Exodus. So there's a lot of agricultural imagery in Hosea. So this whole idea of a second Exodus could be dramatically expanded if we were to include all that agricultural imagery. The question is it fair? And I'm not really sure what the answer is, so I'm not going to include it right here. But I think I've included enough to say that there is a second Exodus in Hosea. And that's important for what I'm going to say next. So let's talk about the quotation in Matthew. One of the things that Dr. Mosley said is that you can't really address this verse in Hosea or any Old Testament passage that's quoted in the New without exploring what is the relationship between the two. And this is one of the particularly tricky ones. I mean, this is probably in a top 10 list, maybe some people's top 5 list. So first we need to just acknowledge that there's a bunch of principles that are lurking in the background. So if we don't acknowledge these principles, then what could happen is you and I could have totally different views on how Hosea 11:1 is quoted in Matthew, And we might not even acknowledge that the reason we have different views is that we had different approaches, and we ended up at different destinations because we just took different roads. So there's actually a lot of principles lurking in the background on this issue. And for those of you who've taken Dr. Merkel's advanced hermeneutics class, we read at least one, maybe two books on this. Yeah, we read two. So first principle. This is one of the books that we read, 3 Views on the New Testament Use of the Old Testament. Single reference versus multiple reference. So the question is, can an Old Testament passage have an obvious reference in the Old Testament context and also a secondary reference in the New Covenant or in the New Testament that is kind of unearthed by the New Testament author? Or does every passage have one referent? So I believe it was Walter Kaiser in this 3 Views book who said essentially always one referent. And then it was what's the guy at Dallas? He wrote the Luke commentary, Daryl Bach. He basically said 2 reference. And then, if I remember correctly, it was Pete Enns basically just said the world is complicated, I don't know. So, a related question, but slightly different. Can the Holy Spirit have a hidden meaning or referent that the human Old Testament author is not aware of? This is actually a big one. And it kind of actually answers the first question if you come to an answer on this one. So I would wager that there's actually a huge diversity of opinions on this question at our campus. I'll just go ahead and show my cards. I totally believe that the Holy Spirit has quote-unquote hidden meanings in the Old Testament that were not known to the Old Testament authors or to the Old Testament readers, but I do believe that because of progressive revelation, they kind of were more and more unearthed until you get to the era of apostolic interpretation, and then just boom, it's the lid is blown off. Okay, so the next issue, which is apostolic interpretation, are we playing by the same rule book? And this was something that Thomas also brought up way back in the beginning of the semester. Can we take the same approach as the apostles? And this is why this whole thing is really convoluted, because Walter Kaiser is basically, I think, in the 3 Views book, trying to say that we should be able to use the same method as the apostles. And the reason is because it was only one referent, and the apostles just showed us what it was. But if there's 2 referents, then it's probably going to be hard to say that we can play by the same rulebook as the apostles. So that's something to consider. And then the third question, this becomes really important, I think especially in this one, but really all over the New Testament. I would say in the Old Testament, I would say over the past 2 years, I'm not sure there's anything that's transformed my reading of the Old Testament as much as the issue of typology has. How does typology affect Old Testament interpretation? In other words, once you know there's a type, what do you do when you read the antitypes in the New Testament? What do you do when you read the type in the Old Testament? Do you try to put your horse blinders on and read it as though you didn't know the antitype was coming? Or do you go, this is awesome, I knew the whole picture now. So, and then another related question is typology valid outside of explicitly identified types and antitypes? Again, you would see a diversity of opinions on this question on our campus, and I know that because that was asked in Hebrew 4, and there was a diversity of opinions. So, this is something that I think we have to think about. We might not all come to the same answers on these questions, but the method is so important, as we all know. And we really need to think through these questions deeply so that we can have very logical, objective reasons for the interpretations that we make. All right, so let's talk about the context in Matthew before we really firmly answer the question. So I'm just going to read this real quick. This is Matthew 2:13-15. When they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Okay, now we're going to skip a few verses. Rachel weeping for her children and that stuff, and read 3 more. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, "Rise, "Take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. Okay, so I'm just going to pause here before I go on to the next slide. Awesome book on understanding Matthew is Dr. Quarles' A Theology of Matthew. It's just a really, really fantastic book. I highly recommend it. One of the main themes that he shows throughout the Gospel of Matthew is that Matthew is over and over again showing us how Jesus is the antitype to Moses' type. And the way that Dr. Quarles words it is that he's the new Moses. So he calls him the new Moses, new Abraham, new David, and new... I don't remember what the other one is. Anyway, and we see it again and again. We actually see it right here in this in this very passage. That those who sought the child's life are dead. That's almost the exact same thing that God says to Moses when Moses is in Midian, and this is God's explanation for why it's time for Moses to go back to Egypt, where the people of God are. So, with this backdrop in mind, that Jesus is being portrayed as the new Moses in the Gospel of Matthew, now let's cover one more base before we kind of come to a tentative answer on the Hosea 11:1 quotation. So, here's what I would like to say. If we consider Moses and Jesus, this is basically what's going on, I think, in Matthew 2. Moses was born in Egypt. He flees to Midian, and he returns to Egypt. And he returns to Egypt to execute the first Exodus, or to lead the first Exodus. Jesus, the antitype, is born in Israel. He flees to Egypt, and then he returns to Israel. So you see the pattern right there between the lives of Moses and the lives of Jesus. So what happens when Jesus returns to Israel? Well, the typology would indicate that Jesus is going to lead the second Exodus. So if we go back to the quotation, right here, "Out of Egypt I called my son," what I would like to propose is that this whole time we've been misunderstanding Matthew, and by we I mean, really I mean the people who are saying that Matthew botched this. I'm not saying necessarily like we in this class, but a lot of people have misunderstood Matthew here and basically said Matthew does not know the context of Hosea, because in Hosea, God is talking about how he drew the Israelites out of Egypt. Well, I don't think that's what Matthew is saying. I think what Matthew is saying is, in order for this all to make sense, for the typology to work, Jesus has to go down to Egypt and come back. In other words, I don't think Matthew would want us to focus on "out of Egypt I called my son," on Jesus traveling out of Egypt in fulfillment. No, what Matthew really means is that the fulfillment is coming in the new Exodus. And it's fulfilled in the sense that Hosea understood that there was a second Exodus coming, and that the first Exodus itself, and Hosea's reflections on the first Exodus, and Yahweh's communication with Hosea about the first Exodus, because of typology, what is this all pointing to? It's like shining a spotlight on the second Exodus. And so what Matthew is doing is essentially saying, boom, this is the guy. This is the one, because he's the new Moses. He takes the same journey that Moses took. There's this association with Egypt. And Egypt was the first Exodus, but the new Exodus is going to be much more significant, and he's here to lead us out of the second Exodus. So that's how I handle the Hosea 11:1 quotation in Matthew. I'd love to hear if other people have questions. This is a really easy passage to connect to Christ in some ways because it's right there in Matthew. It's hard in other ways because I feel like I still haven't even explained this exactly how it is in my head, and so I need to still do some thinking about how to explain this in a logical and precise manner. So this is the connection to Christ then, that Jesus comes to rescue us from bondage to sin and slavery in the same way that Yahweh rescued his people. Yahweh set his love on the Israelites and then called them out of Egypt. And for those of us who are in Christ, he set his love on us when we didn't deserve it and called us out of bondage to sin and slavery. So let's review and consider the main point of each verse. God loved Israel and manifested his love by delivering them. Israel turned away from God and sacrificed to idols. This was because Ephraim did not give God credit for delivering them. God's redemption was patient, it was kind, and it was undeserving. And Ephraim's hoped for salvation by Egypt will fail. Instead, Ephraim will be enslaved by Assyria. And Assyria will destroy Ephraim. So what are the big ideas? God disproportionately shows love to those who are undeserving. And his love extends even up through adoption. That's something that we haven't even explored yet in this passage. Out of Egypt I called my son. He calls his people out of bondage to sin, and he provides for the spiritual needs of his people. They're wandering through the desert, and he's providing. Well, again, if we look at this typologically, God is providing for the spiritual needs of his people. Sin and idolatry anger and sadden God. And God offers many opportunities to return to him. When he talked about, it was in verse 5, they have refused to return. There's an implication there that many opportunities were given. Attempts to circumvent God's revealed will end in disaster. So, this is something that Matt Woodmaster brought out a couple weeks ago really well, that Israel's just playing games with Assyria and Egypt, and geopolitically we look at it and it's like, dude, what are you doing? Little tiny nation, it's just not going to work out. So they weren't supposed to do that. If they had relied on God, if they had returned to him and trusted in him, it would not have ended that way. But attempts to circumvent God's revealed will end in disaster. And the first Exodus points to the second Exodus. And some applications. I would just say gain a healthy appreciation for how our sin displeases God. It's something you can see, especially when we're talking about the rhetoric. I taught Ephraim to walk. It's just very, there's an obvious frustration and anger there. So, and then give thanks to God that he is a God who loves rescuing and adopting his people. This is remarkable that God would rescue and adopt and make sons out of people who are just not worth it from a human perspective and are not worthy at all. Actually, I remember 4 years ago, I was in a Bible study. I was living in a place temporarily, and they were doing this Bible study through Hosea. And I remember there was this line that the Bible study leader used over and over again. He said, even when I was completely unlovely, God loved me. And I think that comes up again and again in Hosea. And again, when we consider the second Exodus, we see it in our own hearts. We think about the sin that God rescued us from. Even when I was unlovely, God loved me. And then I would say next, see the warning here. Take it seriously. Take it as a sincere warning for yourself. And when it's appropriate, it's not always appropriate, but when it's appropriate, warn those who are under your spiritual care that there are serious consequences for turning away from God. And then finally, just thank God that he's redeemed us fully and finally. And this is the new Exodus. It's a better Exodus. He gave us his Spirit as a down payment of our inheritance. And then, last. Spend some time chewing on your OT hermeneutic. I've still got a lot of work to do here. I really would appreciate any feedback you guys have on a lot of this stuff. As Proverbs says, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. So we need to sharpen each other when it comes to our Old Testament hermeneutics. And I don't just mean hermeneutics like the various tools, but the hermeneutic, the method we use. So the one sentence summary. This is what we'll close with. I need to move this one sentence summary up because it's kind of depressing to end all these passages in Hosea with a depressing summary like this, but oh well. Although God loved, adopted, and delivered Israel, he would send them into exile for their refusal to return to him. All right, let me know what you guys think. Hope you enjoyed it.